What's up, y'all? This is just a quick video to respond to a retweet by concept artist RJ Palmer. I feel like if I respond just on Twitter, the tone will get all messed up, and my attempts at humor always seem to go awry on the social media. So I'm just making a video to respond as though we were just having a conversation in person, which is my preferred way to talk about this stuff. So the retweet is of a piece of art from the 1960s that's been going around by William Barry. And concept artist and sometimes paleoartist RJ Palmer retweeted, "Now and then I see someone make the argument that current paleo art will be comical in 100 years. Then I see stuff like this. These pieces are from the 60s. Like, if you follow the bones and use strong references from nature, you can only be so incorrect. These look contemporary." I'm responding to this because he's talking about my argument. And I normally wouldn't respond to something like this, but RJ's been kind of sniping at my work and the work of my collaborators by extension, and I've ignored most of it, but he's got a huge social media following, and misinformation can sometimes go farther than the latest cutting-edge science that has been hard-earned by paleontologists and preparators and anatomists and biologists who are out in the field and in the lab toiling over trying to figure this stuff out. I love everybody in the paleo art community. I want to see people make the best art they possibly can and make money off of their paleo art and develop their paleo art. Even people who have disparaged me and criticized me and been rude to my face, it's fine, yo. Like, do your thing. But just understand that if you disparage science-based paleo art long enough and your misinformation has a further reach than a lot of the scientists who are working really hard to do incredibly thorough work, I might do some science communication on your behalf. So what I'm going to do is just respond to this by having a look at the art and assessing it from the perspective of a paleo artist who has been working with paleontologists who work on Morrison Formation dinosaurs for the last 5 years. Specifically, the scene shows an Allosaurus chasing some kind of an ornithischian dinosaur in a Morrison Formation, sort of a typical Morrison Formation paleo environment. Of course, people want me to comment on the theropod because that's what everybody's interested in. So I'm going to actually get to the theropod last. I'm going to go from the environment forward. This actually isn't a terrible reconstruction of the Morrison paleo environment, but it's pretty basic in that it's a very broad brush stroke reconstruction of the plant life and surrounding landscape. And I mean that literally broad brushstroke, but also figuratively. I mean, it's kind of unclear what this plant material in the background even is. I mean, grass hasn't evolved yet, so maybe that's supposed to be horsetails like these ones in the foreground. But overall, this reconstruction of the environment is typical of Morrison Formation scenes where the plant life and surrounding ecology gets very little attention. And that's unfortunate because that lack of attention on the plant life in the Morrison has created a lot of persistent misconceptions about the Morrison paleoecology and climate that persist to this day. And we're only just now starting to make some really interesting discoveries about the plant life and ecology of the Morrison, which we'll actually be covering in upcoming installments of my documentary Jurassic Reimagined. So moving from the surrounding environment up the food chain to the herbivore, we have some kind of ornithischian dinosaur. This reconstruction isn't clearly anything that we have in the Morrison. It's kind of Dryosaurus sized, but the skull shape is totally wrong for Dryosaurus or for Camptosaurus. I guess it could be passed off as a baby Camptosaurus, but a bunch of the body proportions are wrong. Camptosaurus have these really enlarged ilia on their pelvis. They would have had really big back ends. The overall skull shape is a bit off for Camptosaurus. It kind of looks like an iguanodon hybridized with a Thescelosaurus, but none of those are really Morrison dinosaurs. So it's certainly not contemporary based on what we now know of the ornithischian dinosaurs that were running around in the Morrison. So the Allosaurus also has some pretty major issues. This wide, short skull looks to me to be clearly based on the American Museum of Natural History Allosaurus mount from 1908. Edward Drinker Cope found an Allosaurus skeleton. It had a partial skull, and they sculpted the rest of its skull. What they sculpted looks just like this short, wide skull, which isn't accurate. Since then, we've found more completely preserved Allosaurus skulls, and we now know that they have a much narrower skull, it's a bit longer, And the horns on the frontals and lacrimals that make these crests on Allosaurus are much more exaggerated in the well-preserved skulls. And on top of the bony crenulations and knobs and lacrimal horns, we would expect some type of a keratinous covering. That would have enlarged these horns substantially. We don't know exactly how much, but it's probable that there was a lot of individual variation. And so overall, the skull shape is a bit wrong. It's also an interesting detail that the artist included an alligator-like tongue, basically a very reduced tongue. The teeth seem to protrude directly from the gum line without really any lip material. The tongue especially is unlikely, as the strange flap-like tongues of crocodilians are a derived trait that they evolved when they took on a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Those flattened tongues form a flap in the back of their throat that keeps water from sloshing down their throat when they're eating things in the water. The null hypothesis for dinosaur tongues would be that they had tongues something like a tuatara, kind of your basic fleshy reptilian tongue. Tuataras are these lizard-like things that live in New Zealand. Allosaurus is much closer to the bird part of the reptile tree than tuataras, and it's a really evolved super predator. It's an apex predator. It's got a bunch of adaptations for that lifestyle. I would be willing to speculate, and I think a lot of paleontologists would support this, that these things probably had a tongue somewhat like a modern bird of prey, or something with keratinous spines or hooks on it, something to actually increase the friction on the tongue so they can actually pull meat into their mouth. We see that kind of an adaptation in a number of modern predators. It's cool that he's looking at reptiles in the 1960s and trying to reconstruct this based on, the available data. But the overall head and skull shape, even for the 1960s, it's a little bit behind the time. I think at that point they had already found some of the more complete Allosaurus skulls. Another detail that isn't contemporary at all is the neck length. Allosauruses have surprisingly long necks. Their neck is just about as long as their rib cage. So you could maybe try and claim that there's a big S-curved neck curving inside of that soft tissue envelope. I feel like if you were going to make that claim, you'd want to sort of paint those volumes to suggest that there's a lot of loose, wrinkly skin to allow a big S-curved neck inside there. One of the things that this almost gets right is the hand position. The Allosaurus's hands are in more of like a clapping position. They're not pronated with palms down, like what we would call bunny hands. But there's still some issues with them. The muscular reconstruction really looks like a lizard, and the claws are way too small, even if you were just illustrating the bone core of the claw, the bony center of the claw that's preserved in the fossil record. These claws are too small even for that, but we know from studying modern birds that there were these really enlarged keratin sheaths on claws, especially claws used for prey capture. One of the other pieces that's presented with this is this reconstruction of the theropod forearm. And at first glance, it really looks cool. It looks believable and plausible. And this is actually a great example of how realistic looking art can be really deceiving. Because at first glance, it looks good, but when you look closer, there's some major issues with it. First of all, the biceps muscle should descend actually under the pectoralis muscle. The deltopectoral crest is this bump on the humerus that the deltoid muscle wraps around onto from the back, and the pectoralis muscle inserts into on the front. So the pectoralis pulls the arms closed, the deltoid pulls the arms back. It really looks like the bicep would interfere with the pectoralis muscle inserting into that deltopectoral crest. An even more glaring example of something that's kind of very wrong is that the triceps longus muscle, a muscle that should attach at the elbow and go all the way up the scapula. It also looks like the scapula is at a funny angle in there. The triceps longus should attach to the elbow and go all the way up to the scapula. And that's the muscle that when it contracts, it makes the arm extend. That muscle group is completely missing in this muscle reconstruction. So the head is from 1908. The neck is verifiably way too short. And then when we get to the back end, it's a whole big, huge mess. There's something going on with the thigh here. There's like a butt above the thigh with this weird constriction here that makes basically no sense. It looks like he was trying to blend some kind of crocodilian and bird features, but hadn't been all that rigorous in that reconstruction. So I'm going to actually explain what we now think, what the current thinking is on how the hind limb musculature of theropod dinosaurs worked based on birds and crocodilians. Okay, so what we have here is a sketch of the bones of the rear end of Allosaurus. The tail is going this way, and I haven't drawn the whole tail here because I wanted to show the pelvis from the front view. This is the pelvis, the leg, and some of the rib cage sketched in pretty loosely. Now, a lot of people ask me when I'm doing science communication stuff, what are these bones hanging down here from the pelvis? Little boys always make jokes about these bones. In reality, these bones are really important to our understanding of how the theropod hind limb works. This is the ischia. There's two bones that kind of come together in the back called the ischia, and this is the pubes, and it's two bones in the front that come together. Now you'll notice that they come together almost as low as the knee, and they're spread pretty far apart. And there's a reason for that. These bones are muscle attachment points for an important group of muscles that keep the legs pulled together towards the midline. Now, in modern birds, the pubes and ischia have both swung way back, and birds hold their femur in what anatomists call a subhorizontal position. Their femur is up here, and it doesn't move very much when they're running. They mostly run by kicking out their tibiotarsus, their tibia and fibula that have kind of fused together in birds. So birds have this funny way of running where they're not moving their femur very much, but they're kind of kicking out their knees. And the reason for that is because they've lost their long tail and put a whole bunch of muscle on their front end for their big wing muscles. The long tail in Allosaurus is another really important muscle attachment point. There's huge muscles that run down the tail called the M-cauda-femораlis longus muscles that insert into the femur here and pull the femur back in order to make the leg pull back and drive the animal forward. In crocodilians and in birds, the whole surface of these bones hanging down is clothed in muscle that attach to the inside of the leg. The ischiotibialis muscles that connect down to the inside of the tibia. There's also the pubo-ischiotibialis muscles and something. Altogether, this group of muscles constrains the movement of the leg. They hold the leg in toward the midline, and they would connect all along here. So in a lot of paleo art, you see the pubic bone and the ischium sticking way down out of the belly of the animal. That's not actually accurate. We know from studies, dissections of crocodilians and birds, that this whole area would have been filled up with this mass of really important muscles that would have held that femur close to the body. Without these muscles, when this big long animal turned, they could easily dislocate their hip or do the splits. And that would be bad if you're trying to run down prey, as in the paleoart that we've been discussing. Now, as I mentioned, there's another big important group of muscles connected to the tail. That's the M-cauda-femораlis longus group, and it inserts into this lump on the back of the femur called the fourth trochanter. And people who study these muscles in crocodiles find that in crocodiles who move around with their tail, the M-cauda-femораlis longus muscle is huge, and it fills this whole area under the tail. On top of that, there's muscles that attach to the spinous processes on top of the tail, and those are necessary for stiffening the tail so that when this giant M-cauda-femораlis longus muscle fires, the tail is held straight, and the thing that gets pulled back is the femur. These muscles actually go over the M-cauda-femораlis longus and completely turn this tail into a giant mass of meat. I've been talking a lot about this with Oliver Demuth, and his feeling is that when you reconstruct dinosaur tails, you should basically just draw two straight lines from the ischium and the ilium. This is the top of the pelvis, or the top of the muscles that would have covered the top of the tail. Just basically draw a straight line back to the end of the tail. It should be about that massive based on what we know about the musculature of modern crocodilians. Now, that's only part of the musculature. So we've reconstructed the inside of the leg, sort of the groin region, but now we need the muscles that pull the leg, kind of stabilize it, and also help to pull it up and move the tibia around.
And so we have the iliotibialis muscle group, this massive muscle group that attaches to the ilium and comes down and attaches at various points on the tibia. This muscle group is big, chunky thigh muscles that fill this whole area in. And we would expect them to just completely fill up this whole zone. Now, wrapping around this in various ways, there's the muscles of the calf. I'm not going to get into reconstructing each one of these muscles in detail, but we can get a general sense of their mass by looking at things like ratite birds and chickens, birds that are running around similar to theropods on their back legs. The difference being that theropods have this really long femur that swings back and forth, whereas birds tend to have a shorter femur that doesn't swing very much at all, and they have a long tibiotarsus, so the shin bone is a lot longer in birds, and the metatarsals are a lot longer in birds. So these muscle groups would have tendons that run down the foot. There'd be some small stabilizing muscles in the foot, and then we'd have a soft tissue envelope around this foot, giving it a lot of padding. We know from footprints that these things had a lot of padding around their feet. So when we start to reconstruct this and really fill all these spaces in, we end up with a really chunky back end without a lot of space in between the legs. So if I draw in the iliotibialis muscles here, filling all this area in, and then we know from crocodiles and birds that there'd be all of these back muscles completely engulfing the ilium and the spinous processes coming out of the vertebrae. Now, in the case of dinosaurs and crocodilians, those muscles engulfing the spinous processes on the tail actually go a little bit above the spinous processes, and there's usually a big ligament that connects all of those. Ligaments are the rubber bandy connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. We would expect something similar along the back of bipedal theropods as well. Will hold up their whole front end, and big ligaments again connecting these spinous processes. Now, along the belly, there's these small ribs called gastralia. And what these ribs are actually ossified ab muscles. So these dinosaurs would have had this massive ab muscles connecting to the pubes here. And those muscles were they needed to be so stiff in order to keep the animal's body from bending too much here that they actually got reinforced with calcification. They developed little ribs in there. And then this whole body cavity would just be completely sheathed in muscle. If we drew in the scapula here, this whole area would be buried in muscle. You would not see the scapula at the surface at all. So when we reconstruct this animal according to what we know from birds and crocodiles, it ends up looking a lot like a really chunky bird with a really fat tail down the back.
I think the reason why this art has gotten a bit of traction in the online paleoart community is because it's better than people expect for the 1960s. Because when people think of the 1960s, they think of things like Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion animated dinosaurs in Valley of Guangxi in 1 million years BC, and some of the more mainstream paleoart reconstructions from that time period, which illustrates an important point. Pop culture paleoart has been consistently 20 to 30 years behind the cutting edge of scientific paleoart, which William Barry's work represented in 1960. Now, 60 years have gone by. We've learned a lot. We've dissected a lot of living animals. We've studied ecology. We're still making new discoveries in the Morrison. And so this art really isn't contemporary at all. The reason I'm making this video is not to disparage anybody, but really to kind of issue a challenge to the people on the more concept art side or pop culture side of paleoart. We can close this gap between the cutting edge science and the pop culture depictions of prehistoric animals that we see in things like movies and video games. R.J. Palmer, who's been very critical of my work, has made impressive efforts to that end, but if this looks contemporary, that's because a lot of what we think of as acceptable paleoart is really pop culture paleoart that's way behind the cutting edge science, but we haven't had good opportunities or we haven't successfully science communicated about the differences that we've learned over the years through rigorous study of modern animals and the fossil record. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope this wasn't too much of a rant. I love this paleo art. I appreciate all of you, and I think you're doing great work. Honestly, I don't know how I got on RJ's bad side to where for multiple months now, I'll get little notices from people being like, have you seen this? They're talking about your art again, and it's negative. Much respect to the artists out there. I want to see pop culture paleo art catch up to the cutting edge of scientific paleo art. And I'm happy to share my process and my understanding and my resources and access to paleontological stuff as much as I possibly can. All I really ask is that people have fun, interesting conversations that make it okay for paleoartists to explore new hypotheses and present new reconstructions. I think it's fairly telling that as an artist, when I incorporate new ideas from paleontologists, very often people accuse me of making stuff up. That's pretty regressive, and I know that that discourages a lot of younger artists or aspiring paleo artists. And I don't want to see things go that way. I want to see great artists who have amazing technical skills, like R.J. Palmer, really bring their art to that cutting edge level of science. Listen to the input that scientists give you. I'm sorry if any of my tweets have come across as negative. I'm usually joking. Like, if you know me in person, I kid around a lot. I rib people. I talk a little smack. But for me, it's all love. I want to see the art form elevate. I love and respect all of you. Stay strong. Holler at me. Peace.